Hello and welcome to Policing TV. I'm Jason Harwin and I'm delighted to be hosting the latest episode in our series Exploring Policing and Drugs. As many will know, illicit drugs is linked to a significant number of homicides and serious violence, along with acquisitive crime and the exploitation of very young people, including young people. In the most recent National Crime Agency annual strategic assessment, they stated it had never been more dangerous to take illicit drugs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Brown, who's the Global Director of Counter-Narcotics Technology at Rikaku Analytical Devices and has substantial law enforcement experience from the US. During this episode, Michael will share with us some detail of his law enforcement expertise and his current work. He'll share with us the US experience of dealing with fentanyl and the implications for the UK, and we'll discuss how the cartels are seeking to grow their operations and what they fear most from European policing. And finally, importantly, he'll share with us lessons from the US that will be really important for the UK in this space. So, Michael, a massive welcome. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. And to start off with, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you, and good morning. Thank you for the invitation to appear on your show. My name is Michael Brown. I recently retired from the Drug Enforcement Administration, also known as DEA, where I spent 32 years working primarily in the overseas arena. I spent about 25 years working overseas, targeting specifically precursor chemicals, working in Central and South America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. I'm currently the Global Director for Counter-Drug Technologies for a company called Rikaku. They make Raman spectroscopy, otherwise known as a handheld laser, which can be used to identify unknown chemicals used in the production of narcotics.
So, Michael, tell us a little bit more about the problem of fentanyl in the US.
Well, as you know, fentanyl is a major problem in the United States. I would consider it the number one strategic threat to U.S. health and to our security. The U.S. has a unique situation. It was launched into, or I should say, catapulted into fentanyl addiction from the pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, who produced a very strong synthetic opioid called Oxycontin starting in 1996. So for approximately the next 22 years, Purdue Pharma poisoned tens of thousands of Americans with Oxycontin, creating a huge addiction problem. Then one day it was regulated and it was cut off, and tens of thousands of Oxycontin users turned to Cartel Street heroin and then became addicted to that. The cartel saw an opportunity with fentanyl, which had been floating around in the US as early as 2012, and they came up with the idea of let's recruit or create a new paradigm of drug user, and these are the former users of Oxycontin. So we're talking about tens of thousands, perhaps millions of new drug users from the prescription side now coming into the illicit opioid or synthetic opioid side. So the cartels came up with the idea to create a fake Oxycontin or an M30 pill and then distribute it, and it was an overnight huge success. So the cartels were very successful in creating that new paradigm prescription drug market, now shifting it to the illicit side. And these are individuals who were not predisposed to illicit narcotic usage, had no intention of ever becoming a drug user, but were lured into addiction through Oxycontin and Purdue Pharma. And this is the difference why the U.S. has this major fentanyl problem as opposed to the U.K. or other countries in the world.
Yeah, and in the UK at the moment, we've seen over the last 12 months a significant increase in drug-related death linked to synthetic opioids, particularly linked to nitazenes. And whilst we are seeing elements of fentanyl in the UK, we're not seeing, thankfully, the scale that is in the US. Now, clearly you touched on there about the cartels utilising the need to exploit opportunity to increase their operations. Talk us a little bit more how they're actually now looking to exploit into Europe.
Well, let's look at the drug addiction situation in Europe, specifically the UK. In 2021, the UK had roughly 58 deaths related specifically to fentanyl. In 2022, there was roughly, I believe it was 5,000 individuals who related fentanyl or drug overdoses, of which 857 related to cocaine, but then 2,000 were related to opioid usage, heroin, fentanyl, and of course you mentioned nitazenes. So who are the cartels? When we say cartels, I'm specifically talking about the two primary Mexican cartels, and that would be Sinaloa, CJ&G, or the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which are responsible for flooding Europe with approximately, I think some numbers, 327 metric tons in 2023 of cocaine. And of course, we're starting to see fentanyl and what I call the more powerful adulterants. You mentioned nitazines, and some of the other, xylazine, perhaps making its way into the UK. And in my opinion, these adulterants increase the potency of fentanyl and, of course, increase the probability of a fatal overdose when they're added into the fentanyl, which, as you know, is very strong.
And obviously in terms of the UK particularly, and not being complacent around fentanyl, and like you say about how within the US the market was exploited by the cartels, is there anything particularly we should be doing now around fentanyl or preventing fentanyl outside and including law enforcement?
Well, again, I think if you look at the U.S. situation, how the cartels targeted prescription drug users, if I was in the UK, if I was part of the government, I'd be looking at how does the prescription drug situation look in the UK? Or what are the rates of addiction to prescription drugs? Do we have prevention programs working with prescription drug users? Because that is the largest demographic that could be enticed to what I call be part of a forced transition from prescription drugs to heroin, which is on the decline. Surprisingly, in 2023, there was a decrease in the amount of heroin being seized, but there was an increase in the amount of cocaine being seized. So I think for now the UK is in a safe space, but I would not be complacent, because obviously, as you're seeing in the United States, the traffickers are putting fentanyl into everything, into cocaine, into methamphetamine, and even lacing it into marijuana.
And again, importantly, the prescription issue is becoming an issue in the UK. We know it is in terms of those that have been prescribed opioid-based drugs for a period of time. The fact is they're becoming more and more tolerant, so therefore require stronger strength, and ultimately are looking at other opportunities through the illicit market to top up that strength. So I think we certainly cannot be complacent in the UK. And again, taking account of the US experience about that particular group of individuals that traditionally would not be seen ones that would be utilising illicit drugs, because actually they're being prescribed drugs within the UK system anyway. Just in terms of the police and the cartels, and again, Michael, you obviously have significant experience around that, and again, the issues around Europeans' response to cartels. Is there any particular learning you think you could share with viewers today about approach to cartels? Do the cartels fear the European policing? Is there more things we could be thinking to do?
Well, I think one of the things that the DEA, we have a DEA office in London, we have DEA country offices in every country in Europe. There's a very good working relationship between DEA and law enforcement in the EU. Recently working through Interpol, there was a large-scale, multi-country investigation that took down a significant drug trafficking organization linked to the Mexican and South American cartels. This is the key, in addition to looking at your prescription drug usage, having your drug prevention and drug treatment programs. The UK as a whole has to approach these cartels. Individually, they will not be able to do it. If the UK was just to work in their own silo, there's no way they're going to penetrate and break down the groups like the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa cartel and CJ&G are in every country in the EU. It's what I call part of a criminal colonization, right? Cartels come in and they colonize and they create drug hubs and drug spaces. For example, the Sinaloa cartel has established a very strong alliance with the Albanians and the Romanian drug trafficking organizations, as well as La Cosa Nostra and Dragana, and some of the other domestic drug trafficking groups. It's very interesting how the EU works together as a whole. Drug trafficking organizations and criminal groups in the EU also work together as a whole. And you have the new border situation where there really are no borders. So tons of narcotics can come in through Amsterdam, can come in through Spain, Portugal, and then be moved as cargo throughout the EU, feeding these hubs in these various countries. So it's imperative that the UK work in conjunction with the other international organizations and focus hard on how narcotics are coming into the country, how they're being distributed, and most importantly, targeting the Chinese money laundering organizations, who are the world's primary launderers for criminal activity, whether it be drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons. You have to go after the money, because at the end of the day, that's what drug trafficking is all about.
Yeah, it is the commodities, like you say, the money particularly around it. So in terms of the importance of the collaboration, again, I know we've obviously got very good links with yourselves in the US, with Canada, with a number of other big countries that are really important in terms of this space as well. In terms of the US learning, how does the US learn together then in terms of how they respond to it? Because like you say, it's a number of states, it's massive, the country is massive, as you know very well, and importantly around that collaboration and sharing of practice and sharing intelligence as well. Just explain to viewers how that's actually done in the US.
Well, I mean, for example, for many years, the U.S. has had a very good working relationship with the Mexican government, the Colombian government, and Peru, working what I call complex conspiracy cases, multinational, multi-country investigations that result in arrests, convictions, and most importantly, extraditions. The United States has one of the most aggressive counter-drug enforcement prosecutions in the world. We have extradited and prosecuted criminals successfully in the United States. And one of the things that criminals around the world fear is extradition to the United States, because they know there's no way to corrupt the court system. The laws are very strict. And again, that's a very good tool in the investigative toolkit when you're talking about these complex investigations in Europe. Most of these organizations are linked to trafficking groups in the United States, and some of them are vulnerable to extradition. So that's something else that can be utilized by the European authorities to extradite their primary traffickers to the United States, breaking their connectivity to their homegrown organizations, any support they may have within those communities.
And so in terms of one of the other issues for the UK at the moment is around the early identification of obviously synthetic opioids, and again particularly where there's been a death and toxicology results and everything else around it. So there is significant work going into that space at the moment. Again, share some of the experience of the US about how you're helping to identify, and I think with your new role you're doing some of that already, but talk us a little bit more about how you're looking to identify potential lethal drugs in the system as well.
Well, again, it all comes back to cooperation and joint investigations. For example, the United States working closely with Canada. We know that Sinaloa cartels attempting to, they have established fentanyl production laboratories, in Canada to produce fentanyl for distribution back into the United States and to the EU. We've also seen the Sinaloa cartel establish cocaine processing labs in Spain, in France, in Belgium, where they're importing coca paste, converting it to cocaine. Because here's the main link: Europe has a endless supply of precursor chemicals that have been supporting the production of MDMA in the Netherlands. Right? Those chemicals are coming from countries like Germany, chemical companies in the EU, not from China. So the EU collectively has to get a hold and break that chemical supply chain, because when you talk about synthetics, you need chemicals. You break the chemical supply chain, you break the ability of these cartels to produce, because you don't need Mexico and the cartels to produce nitazines, xylazines, benzodiazepines. There can be a transition to using adulterants as the primary drug of choice, removing cocaine, removing heroin. If those were to disappear tomorrow, there would be ample synthetics to supply the numerous drug users in those countries. So for me, the first thing the EU has to do is look at that precursor chemical supply chain, and not just the regulated chemicals, but the dual purpose chemicals. The chemicals you can get from going into a hardware store and making what I call stage 4 precursors to make stage 3, to make stage 2, that then make the prescribed synthetic opioid. So that has to be the first thing that has to be done, because the cartels are simply using those MDMA chemical supply chains to get the new chemicals. And for fentanyl, if you use the Gupta method, you only need 3 precursors, right? Methamphetamine, maybe you need 10 to 15 precursors. Cocaine, 15 to 20 precursors. So if you're a drug trafficker and you want to cut the Mexicans out, well, we'll just get the precursor for fentanyl, make it ourselves, and increase our profit margin, right? But right now, the majority of substance users in Europe is cocaine. So the nexus to shifting to fentanyl really is not there. So perhaps Europe and the UK have a window of opportunity to break that connective tissue to prevent fentanyl from becoming a mainline drug of choice. But of course, once the hook's in, it's virtually impossible to get the hook out. We're seeing that problem in the United States now. We currently have no mitigating strategy to stop the cartels from, one, acquiring the precursor chemicals, mass producing fentanyl, pushing it across the border, and distributing it in every city in the United States. There are states like Massachusetts where fentanyl is the drug of choice. Excuse me. Philadelphia, Kensington Square, which is an epicenter for drug use in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. Fentanyl is the drug of choice. You go out to California, and you look at San Francisco in the Tenderloin area. Fentanyl is the drug of choice. So the cartels have been very successful in pushing in, excuse me, 100% synthetic narcotic, pushing out heroin, and creating a new paradigm of drug user, which, as according to the DEA, 7 out of 10 pills contains a lethal dose. That's probably 1 milligram of more fentanyl that can kill an individual in 30 seconds. Now, if there's a little bit of nitazene in there, a little bit of xylazine or metamidine or some of the other powerful adulterants which render Narcan ineffective, we're going to see higher overdose rates in 2025.
And in terms of where the US goes next in this space, Mike, because like you say, it's quite widespread. It's got a hold in certain areas, in neighbourhoods within the US. In terms of that going forward to try and address this issue, because like I say, once it's got the hook in, I think you described it as the hook in, it's really difficult to release that hook. What sort of things are you thinking, or the US thinking at the minute to try and get on top of it, or at least reduce the harm from the risk that presents?
Well, the two answers to that. The number one answer is, the United States, as you know, has an election coming up. And whoever wins that election, it's going to be paramount that they re-engage China and they re-engage Mexico at the bilateral governmental level to address the precursor chemical issue. One, precursor from China to Mexico, and two, Mexico producing, the cartels producing those precursors, moving it into the United States. Of course, again, for me, the center of gravity is, again, the chemicals required to make fentanyl. And, of course, methamphetamine and other drugs. So at the bilateral level, that's where law enforcement does not have access. That's going to have to be a government-to-government exercise to make that happen. The second thing that has to happen, and this is a problem, I think, where the United States has a split, right? Harm prevention, right? Progressive harm reduction organizations now are in favor of safe drug supply, which is in British Columbia, Canada. In the United States, in the sanctuary cities, we have some decriminalization of personal use drugs. In New York City, you have safe drug injection sites where individuals can come in with their narcotics and use them safely. And I use that word safely in parentheses because they don't know what they're taking, but if they take fentanyl and they overdose, they can be Narcan back to life. Now, again, if there's xylazine or some other dangerous adulterant in that fentanyl, Narcan may not work. So we need a policy change in the United States that, in my opinion, does not enable continued drug use and does not address the long-term addiction that comes with that. Because even with heroin and methamphetamine, a user, continuous use for methamphetamine could be 5 years till you have some sort of situation and you overdose or you have a heart attack, your kidneys fail, secondary mortality related to extensive drug use. Heroin could be 10 to 15 years. And in that time, that's requiring millions of dollars in resources to treat people, hospitalization, mental illness, etc. So, and I know in the UK, I believe there is a safe injection location that's beginning to catch on. To me, that's kind of you're throwing your hands in the air, not just the UK, but any place that has safe injection sites. Canada, safe supply, where they're actually supplying hydromorphine to individuals who are addicted to heroin. It's kind of hey, you know what? We can't address the problem, so let's just become the drug dealer for the citizens to prevent the aspect of the potential of fentanyl getting in the drug supply. That is not the way to go. We are simply creating generational drug use. And in the United States, I've been in the business for 32 years. And in 32 years, drug addiction has only increased in the United States because we're not addressing the root cause, those countries that produce narcotics, those countries that supply the precursor chemicals, and now we're turning to aggressive harm reduction policies that, in my opinion, may keep an individual alive in the moment, but tomorrow the probability of an overdose death increases each time.
And certainly from the UK experience at the moment, the issues because of the increase in synthetic opioid deaths, and again the issues around increasing harm reduction. Again, you might be aware, Michael, that obviously in the UK the first safe consumption room safe injection room, depending which title you want to put it, overdose prevention centre is opening up in Glasgow. It should have opened already, but will be opening in the coming weeks and months as well. And
Correct.
again, there's lots of eyes being focused on that particular location, because obviously again there is a growing strength in voice from a number of communities about the need for that in other parts of the UK, not everywhere, but in parts where clearly there is increased risk for individuals, and again the benefit and the evidence that shows that actually can reduce some of the risk in the short term, and hopefully within opportunities to get those individuals into other pathways as well. So, conscious of time, we're obviously coming towards the end of this episode, but if I asked you to give fellow viewers and obviously again law enforcement colleagues that's in the UK at the minute two pieces of advice in terms of your learning, and you've covered loads in this episode, so I'm really grateful, but two particular things to focus on, what would they be?
I'll give you three things very quickly. One, you have to degrade the precursor chemical supply chain that's supporting the production of narcotics in Europe. Two, you have to increase the level of international cooperation with other agencies across Europe and Central and South America to break those criminal networks and prosecute those organizations, go after the Chinese money launderers, because again, the money is the end game. And three, you really have to be careful with your harm reduction policies, because what we found in the United States, the majority of individuals who go to those sites, the majority do not want treatment. Very small percentage want treatment. And if you look at the safe injection sites in New York City, they've become tourist destinations for drug users. So I would ask the people in Glasgow to look at, because you know what happened in Amsterdam. Thousands of people came to Amsterdam to smoke marijuana. It became a drug use problem. So now you could have a collective amount of people coming to Glasgow. Hey, we can use our drugs there. No one's going to arrest us. And what's that going to bring? That's going to bring more drug dealers to those areas to provide a constant supply of narcotics to go into that location and do narcotics. So I think you have to be very careful on monitoring those sites, monitoring the influx of new drug users, new drug dealers, crime associated with burglaries in order to get the money to buy the narcotics. So and we've seen it in the United States. In any of the cities that have these safe site injection locations or decriminalization, we've seen an increase in crime, we've seen an increase in drug usage, and an increase particularly with cartel or organized crime distribution. So that would be my three things, maybe four, that I would be looking at if I was in the UK or in Europe in general.
Now, they're really sound advice, Michael. I think, like you say, there's lots of evidence base of the benefits of overdose prevention centres, safe injecting locations. But you say there's got to be other measures put in place, and the police have got an important part to play in that as well. Particularly where in the UK at the moment, obviously, possession of drugs, illicit drugs, is illegal, and obviously then the opportunity that presents potentially for serious and organised crime as well. So, Michael, as I said at the start, really grateful for you taking the time out. I know you'll be really, really busy. Really grateful for you to be able to share your insights to the viewers. As I said, this is one of a series of episodes that we're doing around policing and drugs. So, again, if the opportunity does come along as we do this series, it'd be great if I could speak to you again about some of the things I was hearing in the UK. But for now, a massive thank you. Thank you for your leadership in the US, which I know is a very challenging environment in itself because of the scale of the issues that you're facing. But for now, thank you. And for viewers, thank you for watching this one. Again, keep tuned in and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.